The film begins with a big ship called the USS Carl Vinson sailing in the Adriatic Sea during a break in the war between Bosnia and Serbia. The ship's leader, Rear Admiral Leslie McMahon Reigart, was talking to Admiral Juan Miguel Piquet, the leader of NATO. At that time, they were discussing a mission to gather information. Juan reminded Leslie's team to be careful and not to fly over the dangerous zones to avoid any trouble. Leslie promised to follow Juan's orders. Next, in the ship's cafeteria, Leslie's team member, Lt Chris Burnett, was having lunch with his friends. Chris was soon called to meet with Leslie. Chris had turned in his resignation letter because he was tired of doing the same surveillance tasks all the time. When Chris met with Leslie, he was disappointed with Chris's decision because Chris had a promising career in the Navy. However, Chris was determined to leave, leading to a disagreement between them. In the end, Leslie asked Chris to stay for 2 more weeks before leaving the military, and Chris agreed. At another time, Chris and his friend, Lieutenant Jeremy Stackhouse, were on a mission flying their jet to check out an area that was supposed to be free of any military activity during the Bosnian War. As they were flying, they noticed something strange in a place where nothing should be happening. To get a closer look, they turned on the cameras outside their jet and flew lower to see what was going on. To their surprise, they saw a group of Serbian soldiers gathered in this zone, where no military should be. The soldiers on the ground saw the jet flying low and thought it was a NATO jet spying on them and breaking the rules. Because of this, General Miroslav Loker, the leader of the Serbian troops, ordered his men to shoot down the jet. At that time, Chris and Jeremy were shocked when they suddenly saw 2 missiles coming straight at their jet. Jeremy, who was the pilot, quickly tried to avoid the missiles by making sharp turns. In the middle of the chaos, Chris managed to report back to their command center about the danger they were in. As the missiles kept following them, Jeremy decided to drop 2 fuel tanks from the jet to create a heat diversion, hoping the missiles would change direction. One missile exploded, but the other one kept chasing them and eventually hit the back of the jet, damaging it badly. With no other choice, Chris and Jeremy had to eject from the jet to save themselves. On the USS Carl Vinson, Leslie and his crew were shocked when they heard that Chris and Jeremy's plane had lost contact. After looking into it, Leslie found out that their jet had gone off course and left the safe zone. Leslie was confused and wondered why they had left their path. He tried to contact the jet, but the radio and satellite couldn't reach Chris or Jeremy. Not knowing what else to do, Leslie decided to ask Juan and Donnelly from NATO for help. Meanwhile, Chris and Jeremy had managed to survive by jumping out of the jet with parachutes, but Jeremy hurt his leg when they landed. Seeing this, Chris quickly helped by bandaging Jeremy's wound. They both realized that they were now in a dangerous military zone and that the Serbian army might be looking for them. Chris decided to climb to a higher spot to try to contact the USS Carl Vinson and ask for help. While Chris left to find a signal, Serbian soldiers suddenly appeared and surrounded the injured Jeremy. Miroslav, the Serbian leader, started questioning Jeremy, thinking he was a spy. Jeremy told him that he was alone, but Miroslav didn't believe him. He then ordered one of his men, Sasha Ivanic, to kill Jeremy. And Chris, who was watching through his binoculars, was horrified when he saw what happened. He screamed in shock, which gave away his hiding spot to Miroslav's soldiers. They immediately started shooting at Chris, forcing him to run and find a higher place to get a signal. On the other hand, Miroslav, angry that Chris got away, ordered Sasha to find and capture him. After some time, Chris reached the top of a hill and managed to contact the USS Carl Vinson. He told Leslie everything that had happened, including how he and Jeremy ended up in the military zone by accident. Leslie quickly told Chris to head to the pickup spot because help was on the way. But just as the rescue team was getting ready to go, Juan suddenly met with Leslie and stopped the mission. Juan said he had talked with the Bosnian military leaders, who claimed they didn't attack the American jet like Chris had reported. Instead, the Bosnians blamed the Americans for entering the military-free zone without permission. Juan then gave Leslie a tough choice to follow military orders and not rescue Chris, or try to save Chris and risk losing his job in the military. Upon hearing that, Leslie, not wanting to be fired, decided to follow Juan's orders and not save Chris. Meanwhile, Sasha spotted Chris on the hill. There, Sasha tried to shoot him, but Chris managed to avoid the shots by sliding down the hill. Fortunately, Chris was successful and escaped from Sasha's range. At that moment, Chris didn't give up and kept running until he reached the place where he was supposed to be picked up by the USS Carl Vinson. He contacted Leslie again, asking to be rescued. But Leslie, who was ordered not to help, tried to buy time by giving Chris false hope. He told Chris to go to a new, safer pickup spot, even though it was far away. Chris was frustrated when he heard this, knowing how far he would have to go. But Leslie insisted, promising to pick him up at the new location. During the conversation, Serbian troops discovered Chris's location, forcing him to run away again to stay out of their reach. While escaping, Chris accidentally fell into a puddle filled with dead bodies. Thinking quickly, Chris hid under the corpses until the Serbian soldiers left. From this, Chris realized why the Serbian troops were so secretive about the area, cause they were hiding the fact that they had been secretly killing Bosnian Muslims, something NATO didn't know about. After a while, Chris continued his journey and arrived at an abandoned city, filled only with rubble from the war. As he walked through the empty streets, he saw two small children who seemed to be playing. But then, Chris noticed that the children were actually avoiding mines that were scattered along the road. Just then, Serbian troops arrived and started attacking Chris. To escape, Chris had to jump over the mines on the road, and the Serbian soldiers, focused on chasing him, accidentally stepped on one of the mines, causing a big explosion. Fortunately, Chris barely managed to avoid the blasts and, after saving himself, contacted Leslie again. There, Leslie suggested that Chris keep moving east. Frustrated that the pickup point kept changing, Chris expressed his anger, feeling like Leslie was just playing with him. At that moment, Leslie tried to encourage Chris not to give up and to keep going toward the safe zone. With no other options, Chris followed Leslie's instructions. While continuing his journey, Chris managed to hitch a ride in a passing car, unaware that Sasha had found him and was following closely. Sasha reported to his team that Chris was heading toward a location where more Serbian soldiers were waiting. When Chris arrived at his destination, the car he was in was immediately attacked by Serbian soldiers with heavy gunfire. Chris managed to survive with the help of two Bosnian Muslims who quickly took him to hide in an empty building. When they brought Chris to their headquarters, some of the Bosnian soldiers suspected that Chris was the one who had killed and dumped their fellow soldiers' bodies on the hill. Thankfully, one of the soldiers explained that the killings were actually done by the Serbian army. Chris confirmed this, telling them that he had seen the bodies thrown into a puddle. Meanwhile, the Serbian troops, led by Miroslav, found out where Chris and the Bosnian soldiers were hiding and bombed the building. Chris survived the bombing with only minor injuries. Seeing the bodies of Serbian soldiers nearby, Chris came up with the idea to disguise himself as a Serbian soldier to escape more easily. Soon after, Serbian soldiers came to check the building they had bombed to see if Chris was dead. They searched through the rubble and found a body wearing an American pilot's uniform. Miroslav and Sasha examined the body, but Sasha realized it wasn't Chris because the body had a Serbian soldier's tattoo on one arm. Upon knowing that, Miroslav became furious, realizing that Chris had tricked them and was now disguised as a Serbian soldier, walking right past them without being noticed. At the same time, a helicopter sent by Leslie to rescue Chris was already on its way to the safe point. But just before it reached the location, NATO reported that Chris had been killed by Serbian troops, so the rescue team decided to return to base. As the helicopter flew away, Chris desperately tried to signal it by firing his rifle, but his efforts were in vain as the helicopter moved further away. On the USS Carl Vinson, Leslie and his crew were both angry and sad about the news that Chris had been killed by the Serbs. They felt guilty for not being able to save him. Meanwhile, Chris, who was starting to lose hope, noticed a statue that reminded him of when he fell from the fighter jet. He also remembered the video he had taken of the mass grave before he jumped from the plane. This made Chris determined to get the recording so he could reveal what the Serbian army had done to the Bosnian Muslims. As Sasha continued searching for Chris, he finally figured out where Chris was by finding bullet casings from the gun Chris had used. When Chris arrived at the crash site of his fighter jet, he quickly fixed the plane's radio so that the USS Carl Vinson could detect the signal, letting them know he was still waiting to be rescued. Back on the ship, Leslie heard that the mission to pick up Chris was canceled because they thought Chris was dead. Leslie was about to order the USS Carl Vinson to return to base when, suddenly, he received a signal from Chris. Realizing Chris was still alive, Leslie became determined to save him. Even though one suggested contacting NATO, Leslie refused and decided to send a rescue team himself, even if it meant risking his job to save Chris. While Chris was recording footage of the crashed plane, he was suddenly startled by a bomb explosion nearby, making him realize that the enemy was closing in. Without wasting time, Chris quickly continued filming before the Serbian soldiers could reach him. At the same time, Sasha heard that an American rescue team was on its way, so he became more cautious in attacking Chris. Soon after, Sasha carefully approached the spot where Chris was recording the plane. However, Chris tricked Sasha by placing an empty glove behind the wreckage to make it look like he was hiding there. When Sasha fell for the trick, Chris showed up from his real hiding spot in the snow and shot Sasha, causing him to fall. Shortly after, more Serbian soldiers arrived and attacked Chris. Just when Chris was in a tight spot, 2 rescue helicopters appeared and began firing at the Serbian troops. In the middle of the battle, Chris remembered the important footage he had taken of the crash fighter jet, which could prove the war crimes committed by Miroslav and the Serbian soldiers. Determined, Chris turned back, retrieved the recording, and then made it safely to the rescue helicopter. At the end of the film, Chris returns home safely and is warmly welcomed. Many of his fellow soldiers praised him for his bravery in exposing the war crimes committed by the Serbian forces. Because of this, Chris, who had originally planned to leave the military, decided to stay in the American Navy to continue his missions. Meanwhile, Leslie was removed from his position because he had disobeyed NATO's orders. However, he accepted this with pride, feeling that he had made the right choice, and decided to retire. On the other hand, Miroslav and the Serbian soldiers were punished for their war crimes, including the mass killing of Bosnian Muslims. The film ends. The moral lesson from this film is never trust a snowman, cause it might be a soldier in disguise.